This is a Thompson Cast. I am Mel Thompson. Xenophobia is a dislike or fear of people from other countries. The question is whether or not this is selective xenophobia in the case of China or global xenophobia on the part of Australian conservative politicians. The conservative bloc of leaders in Australia is seeking to tighten controls on foreign investors. However, this move comes right after a Chinese property conglomerate made a bid for a 15,000-hectare farming project in the Australian outback. Now, there are two ways to look at this. First is that the Australian political right has an issue with Chinese investors becoming major land and entity owners. If this is the answer, then it is a limited yet distasteful example of political risk dressed up as xenophobia, or as we here in the States like to call it, racism. The second option is that it is a full-blown case of xenophobia and it applies to any foreign investor, no matter their racial makeup. I do not know the answer and will not publicly guess which one, so I'm going with the safe choice and say that this is a direct political risk that is germane to every foreign direct investor seeking to do business in Australia. That being said, you have a political risk that, if codified into law, or in other words, if the law is changed to make it more difficult for foreign direct investment into businesses and farms, this will hamper and or prevent foreign direct investment in Australia overall. The key to predicting how this will all shake out is a Foreign Investment Review Board. This board makes recommendations to the government on whether deals should be accepted or rejected based on what it considers to be in the national interest of Australia. Currently, those who are pushing this broad approach to hinder foreign direct investment are in the minority, and their view is not likely to be taken up and made law by the current Australian government. Bluntly, this had an element in it that was incredibly distasteful because it appeared from statements made by conservative politicians and the overall way in which this was brought up that it was directed specifically at Asians. There is no real chance of such a law being passed, and because of this underlying racial element, it is not something you should be concerned about as a foreign direct investor. And that includes those of you who may be listening to this podcast who are from China. This is not going to be a real legitimate political risk because it's not going to go anywhere. The people of Australia are actually good people. This is a very, very small minority of people trying to push something in a way that is what we in the United States like to call through a back door. They have an ulterior motive, obviously, and it has created the potential for a wide range of political risk for any foreign direct investor. And that's why it is a topic of this particular podcast. However, to avoid the obvious underlying undertones of racial insensitivity as verbalized by some of these right-wing politicians in Australia would be foolish on my part. You have to look at all elements of political risk. That includes even the most distasteful parts of it. And in this case, that particular distasteful part is racism. Now, for those of you who may think that my use of the word racism is a bit over the top, I will leave you with this. Alan Moran, the director of the Deregulation Unit of the Institute of Public Affairs, a non-profit Melbourne, Australian-based think tank, says, and I quote him, "Chinese interest in Australian farms will cause some alarm. People in Australia are quite comfortable with Americans and British and New Zealanders and all sort of stuff, but China is a new guy on the block, and if anything, the strategic alliances we have probably, I don't say they're targeted at China, but China is somewhat different and seem to be, if anything, a future antagonist to Australianism," said Mr. Moran. That was a direct quote from him. Now, what stands out as a sore thumb to me, he's saying that they're basically a bit different. Once again, here in the United States, there's another word we use. It's called code. it's incredibly distasteful. I don't think it's a real political risk, even though this has been in major publications. I think this is just a situation where you have a small minority of right-wing politicians who are in the minority in Australia pushing to do something that is dressed up as in the public interest when in fact it is nothing more than wholesale racism against Asians. Now just imagine if in the United States an American politician said exactly what Mr. Moran was just quoted as saying. What would be going through your mind? One of two things: that's either racist or that's crazy. No matter which one it is, it may be because it came from members of the Australian Parliament that causes direct foreign investors and people like myself to have some concern. You can't take people lightly. You must take them seriously because of their station in life and the fact that they very well may be the future leaders of Australia, and these policies could be implemented at some point. However, once again, because these particular politicians pushing this change are in the minority, this is a very low, if I could even say low, it's essentially a zero political risk. So as you see these articles about clamping down on direct foreign investment in Australia, read the articles thoroughly, read them carefully. You will see that China pops up. You will see quotes from some of these politicians, and it'll be perfectly clear to you that it is directed at Asians. It is not a political risk that would apply to anybody. And as far as Asian investors are concerned, there's no way this is going to go anywhere. It's essentially not a political risk to anyone. But once again, because it came from members of the Australian Parliament, you can't just simply write this off as just talk. You never know what could happen in a country. This has been the Thompson Cast. I am Mel Thompson.